Thank you, Joey. That was very nice. So tonight in our second class, we're going to talk about the life of Ken Wilber. For those of you who have attended any of the 3 previous sessions, you may notice a few things that are the same. I can't rewrite his life, his early life, so I'm just going to hit some of the same highlights. But I feel it's very important that we have a really good sense of where he's coming from. He started out as a scientist, for instance, which isn't something you would necessarily have thought. Anyway, so I'm going to spend the evening talking about his early life, and then next week about half of the class we'll finish it off, and then we'll move on from there. Okay, so I need to share my screen. Okay, so I'm just going to pick up where we left off. Let me see. Aruna, would you be able to read the first reading, please?
Oh, sorry, I have a problem with my eyes that an ophthalmologist hasn't looked at yet. So
no problem. Okay, Jack, would you read this one for us?
Yes. Tomorrow, January 31st, is my birthday, but it is Ken Wilber's birthday, not the birthday of my original face, the great unborn, the vast expanse of emptiness untouched by date or duration, tense or time. This infinite ocean of ease, this vast expanse of freedom, this lucid sea of stillness is what I am in the deepest part of me, the infinite intersection where I am not, and spirit only is. Ken Wilber, One Taste, The Journals of Ken Wilber, page 19.
Thank you. So this is what he looks like if you haven't seen him before. At least that's what he was like as a young man. He's considerably older now. So the aim of tonight's class is to introduce you to the life and thought of a truly gifted human being. According to the dust covers of his books, many notable thinkers hold him in incredibly high regard. So for instance, Houston Smith, world famous author of The World's Religion, says, "No one, not even Carl Jung, has done as much as Wilber to open up Western psychology to the durable insights of the world's wisdom tradition. Slowly, surely, book by book, Ken Wilber is laying the foundations for a genuine East-West integration." Now, Robert Keegan, who's a professor of education at Harvard University, believes that Ken Wilber is a national treasure. No one is working at the integration of Eastern and Western wisdom literature with such depth or breadth of mind and heart as he. According to Father Richard Rohr, a Franciscan friar, wisdom teacher, and founder of the Center for Action and Contemplation in Albuquerque, New Mexico, Ken Wilber is today's greatest philosopher and both critic and friend to authenticate religion, a true postmodern Thomas Aquinas. And Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi, who is one of the founders of the Jewish Renewal Movement and an innovator in ecumenical dialogue, is of the opinion that when Ken Wilber's thought walks through your mind, the door to the next higher level becomes visible. Anyone seeking to update the wisdom traditions of their lineage needs his reality and consequent maps. The Kabbalah of the future will lean on Ken's work. And one last one, Mitch Kapoor, who is the founder of the Lotus Corporation, chairman of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, describes one of Wilber's books, The Marriage of Science and Soul, as philosophy with a tender heart and spirituality with analytical rigor. After reading Wilber, it is impossible to imagine looking at the world the same way again. So, I mean, you have to take these things with a grain of salt because they've been chosen by the publishers to sell the book, right? But I think you'll find as we go through the next few weeks that actually there's a lot of truth in what they're saying. Wilber is blessed with an unusual capacity to absorb, synthesize, categorize, and make sense of vast amounts of information from disparate fields. What he calls his full spectrum model starts from the premise that human development unfolds in predictable stages that extend beyond those recognized by most Western psychologists. Wilber boldly combined the developmental findings of psychology with those in religious traditions, specifically their meditation practices. Okay, let's see. I see Zilda is here. I wonder if you could read this second one for us, Zilda.
Give it a try. Only by moving successfully through each stage, he argues, is it possible first to develop a healthy sense of individuality and ultimately to experience a broader identity that both transcends and includes the separate self.
Okay, thank you. So since 1973, Wilber has been objectively documenting the stages of consciousness development, the deep unvarying structures, including those beyond the ego levels described by Freud and Western psychology. I don't think I saw Hangame. Okay, how about David Oak? Verse number 3.
Sure, coming right up. Wilber maintains that Freud is unmatched in his understanding about the early stages, but he doesn't come close to some of the insights the Buddha had about the higher stages. The Buddha, for all his brilliance, never had any of Freud's seminal insights about early development and the role of the repressed unconscious.
Okay, thank you. So Wilber's meticulous maps of the stages of human development are thus the products of a synthesis of both Western psychology and Eastern spiritual traditions. The result is the most comprehensive cartography of consciousness yet produced, a map that spans the spectrum of human possibilities as they have been defined in both the East and the West. Initially referring to himself as a transpersonal psychologist, he now prefers the label integral psychologist. Whatever the name, he is now generally recognized by his colleagues as the leading theoretician of consciousness in the world. One of his brightest students refers to him as the grand synthesizing theorist of our time. So let's look at what he looked like when he was young. So he did have hair. I don't know if he shaved it at this stage, somewhere in between here. I'm not sure what he's done, but he's remained bald ever since. And it's not as if he has a lot of dark areas of his head where it's clear that there's still hair growing. So I don't know what he's done with it, but anyway. Kenneth Earl Walker II was born on January 31st, 1949 in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. He was his parents' first and only child. His father was a career officer in the U.S. Air Force. Consequently, the family moved to a new Air Force base every few years. Oh, emergency alert. Okay. They moved from the island of Bermuda to El Paso, Texas, and from there to Great Falls, Montana. Then they moved to Idaho and back to Great Falls. Wilber was forced to learn how to adapt to new circumstances as quickly and easily as possible. These many moves had both a positive and negative impact on his character. Okay, let's see. Jennifer, how about you for number 4?
The good news is that you learn a certain type of non-attachment because you are moving all the time. So you make friends, but you lose them a year or two later. You make friends, you lose them. So it was rather traumatic. That part was very hard.
So you'll see that he was being interviewed in 97 by Frank Visser. This is what Frank Visser looks like. He's from the Netherlands. Despite these hardships, Wilber certainly managed to land on his feet. He was elected student body president at 2 different schools. He captained the football team in junior high school. He consistently graduated at the top of his class and gave the valedictory speech at the end of his high school years. At the same time, just to keep the bases covered, as he said, he ran with the Wilder jocks, drank beer, smoked cigarettes, and made trouble. In those early days, he was very attuned to the outward world, very outgoing, and very eager to be liked. The frequent moves were painful. He remembers sobbing almost continuously for several days when he had to leave one town in particular. But they also had their compensations. Stop with this. Are you getting the emergency alerts that I'm getting?
No, is this
Yes.
on your
I've got
phone?
them twice in the last 2 minutes, so I'm just going to turn this off.
Yeah.
Sorry. There's enough to keep it trying. Technology.
It's an emergency for what kind of emergency is it?
Oh, it's one of those wide alerts that everybody gets.
Okay.
Okay, sorry. All right, where was I? Okay, so I need, let's see. How about Kim? I saw you on earlier. Kim, would you read the fifth one?
Number 5,
Yes, please.
I learned to get involved with people very quickly and intimately, but also to hold everything lightly. It was a real Buddhist education, to be open and yet to know that everything comes and goes. That's from Tony Schwartz, What Really Matters, Searching for Wisdom in America.
Okay, so this is what Tony Schwartz looks like. A distinguished looking journalist. Because his father's work often took him away from home, Ken was brought up largely by his mother. She evoked in him a strong sense of the aesthetic, implicitly encouraging his interest in things like interior design, fashion, and the world of art in general. How about Linda? Would you read number 6 for me, please?
As a result of her influence, the feminine side of Wilber's character is strongly developed. His father, on the other hand, was an outstanding athlete. For years, he held the New York State record for sprinting. From his father, Ken inherited his athletic build and a disciplined attitude to life, an attitude that would serve him well when it came to the intensive work of writing. Frank Visser, Ken Wilber thought as passion.
Thank you. So, although both of his parents were intelligent, neither of them were particularly intellectual. Yet from the start, Ken was an exceptionally bright and gifted student. He had a natural aptitude for intellectual studies and was inclined to invest considerable time and energy in it. At high school, he soon became known as the brain because he was at the top of his class year in and year out. His parents supported him and gave him intellectual freedom. How about Merrill, number 7, and 8 when we come to it.
My parents were proud of what I accomplished, but neither of them ever pushed me or even said, do your homework. The result was that I ended up following my own interests and pushing myself very hard.
Okay. He graduated from high school in Lincoln, Nebraska in 1967. He then went to Duke University in Durham, North Carolina, intending to become a doctor. Throughout high school, he was passionate about science, building chemistry labs in his basement and winning prizes at science fairs. And Meryl, that's number 8, if you wouldn't mind.
I fashioned a self that was built on logic, structured by physics, and moved by chemistry. My mental youth was an idol of precision and accuracy, a fortress of the clear and evidence. evident.
Right. So, however, when he entered university, Wilber quickly became disenchanted with science. On that, we're going to hear from Robert. Number 9. Oh, I beg your pardon. Yeah. Sorry, I'm getting confused. Yes, it's 9.
I knew what science had to offer, objective knowledge, and it didn't interest me anymore. I wanted knowledge about interior, psychological, spiritual questions, although I didn't yet formulate it that way. I just knew from the very first day that there was nothing the university was teaching that I wanted to know. It was a classical global existential crisis. I was looking for meaning, for God, and I'd run through all the other places you can find it.
Thank you. So by chance, he picked up a copy of Lao Tzu's Tao Te Ching. Here he found an exploration of deeper meaning beyond logic, beyond science, even beyond the ordinary definitions of self. I think we're back at the beginning of our list. David Andrews, number 10.
Okay. It was as if my previous lifelong repression of the sublime was now compelling me to redress the balance with an almost pathological seriousness. Tony Schwartz, what really matters.
And if you could hang in there, we would get to number 11 in a minute and ask you to do the same.
Sure.
Okay. Wilber began reading mystical texts such as the Bhagavad Gita, the Kabbalah, and writings by Aldous Huxley, Houston Smith, and Gary Snyder. He studied Sufism, Hinduism, Buddhism. Alan Watts pointed him to Krishnamurti. Norman O. Brown led him to Freud. Mesmerized by Freud's insights about the early stages of development and the role of the unconscious, Wilber devoured his entire collected works. Okay, number 11.
I hadn't known anything about Freud or about systems of meditation, but now I had this intellectual puzzle. How do all these people and ideas fit together? It was absolutely fascinating to me. Suddenly, I wasn't tinkering with chemistry. I was onto something that had to do with my own happiness, my own salvation, what life was really about. Tony Schwartz, what really matters.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. He quit Duke after his second year and returned to Nebraska, where his family still lived, now firmly committed to pursuing his self-education. He had no real interest in returning to classes. However, in order to get a deferment from the draft for the war in Vietnam, he enrolled at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln with a major in chemistry and physics. Dispensing with his required assignments in short order, he spent the rest of his day, 5, 7, even 10 hours, reading his own syllabus of Eastern philosophy and Western psychology. He ordered books by the dozen from Shambhala Bookstore in Berkeley, California, which specialized in esoteric texts. How about Leslie Cole for 12 and 13? Not together right away, but 12 for now.
I was not doing this for a college degree, a career, tenure, or even a pat on the head. I was doing it because I felt I must. For me, it was a grail search.
So now in his 20s, he began psychotherapy with Bob Young, an eclectically trained, intellectually wide-ranging psychologist, to deal with problems of anger. Okay, so Leslie, number 13 as well, please.
I was very angry at everything and everyone, but it tended to come out in snideness and sarcasm, or simply as anxiety. I went into therapy to deal with all that.
Okay. He soon realized that it was his relationship with his mother that was at the root of this. So Cy, if you could read 14, that would be wonderful. And then 15 in a minute.
Okay. My biggest complaint was that I felt smothered by her and over-sheltered. My father wasn't around a lot when I was growing up, and I became not only my mother's darling kid, but almost a substitute husband. She did the best job she could have, but still felt overwhelmed. I needed to establish my own space without feeling that I'd be abandoned.
Mhm. So this psychologist, Robert Young, became Wilber's mentor. He encouraged him to explore other techniques. He tried Perel's Gestalt, Ira Progoff's intensive journal work, which was his experiential introduction to Carl Jung, and eventually Zen and meditation. Wilber went on to complete his undergraduate work, earned a master's degree in chemistry, and began working towards a PhD. He tutored undergraduates on the side to support himself. One day, a brash, very attractive young woman named Amy Wagner arrived at his house for her first lesson and never left. A year later, in 1972, they were married. They divorced amicably 9 years later due to their differing life direction. Even though his personal life was improving, he realized that he was suffering from a severe case of cognitive dissonance. His academic work was yielding fewer and fewer rewards. David Erickson, how about you for number 15?
Sure. Okay. I had spent my entire life studying science, only to be met with the wretched realization that science was not wrong, but brutally limited and narrow in scope. If human beings are composed of matter, body, mind, soul, and spirit, then science deals handsomely with matter and body, but poorly with mind, and not at all with soul and spirit. I wanted some meaning in the mess of facts I was ingesting. Tony Schwartz, What Really Matters.
Great, thanks. At the same time, he was struggling to reconcile the brilliant but seemingly contradictory ideas espoused by people as diverse as Freud, Fritz Perls, and the Buddha. Okay, so Belinda, if you wouldn't mind, that's number 16.
Most of these thinkers were trying to disprove what everyone else had to say. The Freud people hated the Zen Buddhists, and the Zens hated Freud. Perls hated them all, and each claimed to have the ultimate truth. Sounds like the church is around the corner. My problem was that I felt they were all saying something true, but that none of them had it entirely figured out. It slowly dawned on me that these people weren't all addressing the same level of consciousness. Tony Schwartz, What Really Matters, page 3.
Yeah, so it was no longer a question of who was right and who was wrong, but how do these truths fit together?
Yeah.
As a result, he quit graduate school at the age of 23 and decided to write a book. So this is the book he wrote. The Spectrum of Consciousness. He wrote it in longhand in 3 months, working 12 hours a day and rarely revising. Okay, so that would be Alan Fuller. Would you read this one, please, and the next one in a minute?
Sure.
Yeah, Mark, just before Alan reads that, I guess what I'm gathering from the spectrum of consciousness is that he had ingested all of this material over the years, and suddenly, you know, he did what he does best, which was synthesis and integration, and it all came roaring out.
Yeah, exactly right. And this is where he really starts to show how it's possible to fit psychology as it's practiced in the West with the Eastern traditions by putting them on a spectrum. Sorry, this phone of mine has rung 8 times since I last spoke to you. I'm going to see if I can turn it off. Just hang on.
Is anyone else getting these warnings, or it's an Amber Alert?
I had it just once, Linda.
Yeah, I got it
So
just
did I.
once.
Just once.
It's a child abduction thing.
Yeah, the problem was I hadn't said okay to it, so it kept
I was
reminding
just
me.
going to tell you that.
Oh,
my.
I hope you didn't use your hammer on it before you looked at what it was
I was
asking.
tempted. Okay.
17. When I was writing, I was expressing my own higher self. I had no doubt about that at all. 2 paragraphs into the writing, I knew I'd come home, found myself, found my purpose, found my God. I have never doubted it since.
Wow.
That's a good point, David. It's true. So already, as Jack had said, already displaying his capacity for synthesis, the spectrum of consciousness suggests that psychology, psychotherapy, and philosophy needn't be seen as mutually competing and mutually exclusive. Okay, so 18 again.
Okay.
Please.
Yep. The spectrum of consciousness outlines an integrative approach to the full spectrum of consciousness and experience, in which the different schools and theories, mainstream academic, as well as spiritual or transpersonal, can be understood as focused primarily on one or another part of the same spectrum. Ronald Rothberg.
Yeah. Thank you. So, as they grow, human beings all progress through a spectrum of levels of consciousness. Each expansion of consciousness opens new horizons and brings new challenges and rewards. At the same time, these transitions, or fulcrums, as Wilber was to later label them, introduce the real possibility of difficulty or even failure. If they're not negotiated successfully, more or less personal energy then becomes trapped at this transition point, unavailable to you. Wilber's key insight was to see that the many types of psychological intervention are appropriate to specific levels of consciousness. They're not all addressing the same part of, or the same spectrum. He describes himself as, let me see. Lori, would you be able to read this 19 for me? Whoops, went too far.
Okay. I'm the guy, Wilber told me, only half jokingly, who comes in after the party and tries to straighten up the mess. If you don't have any map when it comes to consciousness, you can wander around and get hopelessly lost. Some people have charted the road better than others, but I found all of the maps to be incomplete and insufficient. I tried to take everyone's map, put them all together, and fill in the voids. That's what a full spectrum map is.
Mm-hmm. So, as it turned out, it took more than 3 years to get this first book published. It was rejected by 20 publishers. Eventually, it was published by Quest Books, a theosophical publishing house. It attracted immediate attention despite his youth, 27 at this point, and his lack of formal credentials in psychology and philosophy. Upon its release, James Fadiman, a founder of the Association for Transpersonal Psychology, stated that Wilber has written the most sensible, comprehensive book about consciousness since William James, which is saying something. The reaction to Spectrum swiftly became overwhelming. Wilber was besieged with offers to teach, give interviews, and appear at conferences. After accepting several speaking dates, he pulled back. as he said in his journal, you end up exactly with what Oscar Levant said to George Gershwin. Tell me, George, if you had to do it all over again, would you still fall in love with yourself? So let's see, here we've got. How about Heather Harvey? For number 20.
You're muted, Heather.
It was completely unbalancing. What you get are a lot of people telling you how great you are. Within a short time, you start believing them, and then you're headed for disaster. I simply didn't feel competent to appear in public. As a teacher, I might have theoretically understood the big picture, but that doesn't in any way guarantee that it will permeate your personal life. There was a lot of growth and personal work I still had to do. I wasn't about to appear in public as an example of the full spectrum person. That's it.
Thank you. So Wilber decided to stay at home in Lincoln in order to focus on his writing and inner work. The latter consisted of therapy with Bob Young using dream work as well as group work and Zen meditation. And then Ingrid Huck maybe could read this next one. 21 and
Sure.
maybe 22 as well, but in a minute.
To help pay his share of the rent, Wilber worked part-time at a series of menial jobs, washing dishes, pumping gas, stocking grocery shelves. It was very grounding for me to get out of the house, he explained. The work I did was often difficult and gruesome, but I never minded it. And the advantage was that when I left work each day, it was done. Any other job would have invaded the rest of my life.
So his second book, which is entitled No Boundary, Eastern and Western Approaches to Personal Growth, followed less than 2 years later. It provided a leaner, more accessible description of his full spectrum model of consciousness. And if you wouldn't mind, Ingrid, number 22 now.
Over the next 10 years, he produced an average of about 1 book a year, each one relating his developmental theories about consciousness to a different field, ranging from evolution to sociology, from anthropology to physics.
So here is a listing of the early books that we're talking about here. So you see the spectrum of consciousness is first, whoops, and then No Boundary. Oh, this is funny, it's not written very well. Okay, so in the next 3 years, he wrote what, 4 books there. The Atman Project, Up from Eden, The Holographic Paradigm and Other Paradoxes, and A Sociable God. Each of these is 200 to 300 pages long. So he was obviously working through, churning through a huge number of theories in each of these fields, coming to grips with them. And then you got to I and Quantum Questions, which is about the mystical writings of the world's great physicists. Okay.
Mark, Wilber himself made an important point there about the spectrum of consciousness. I mean, he was honest enough to admit, and I know this as a writer myself, you can write about something. It doesn't mean that you are the fully integrated living paradigm of what you're writing about. And so he was humble enough at this point to admit that he wasn't the fully realized person on the spectrum of consciousness, even though he was able to write about it. And I certainly admire him for doing that, because he realized that it would have destroyed him if he'd gone on the lecture circuit and started going the way of making money through this other means, that was not going to be good for his spiritual health. So he, he was wise enough to recognize what was good for him and what wasn't. And, I really admire him for saying that, because, many, how shall I put it, quote unquote, spiritual people, they're quite content to let others aggrandize them without bursting the bubble. You know what I mean? And so Wilber was honest enough to admit where he was really at. Yes, he could understand all of these things because of his intellectual capacity, but he was honest enough to admit, doesn't mean that I am the fully integrated spectrum of consciousness myself.
That's right. Plus, it also would have interfered with his ability to write. It would have taken up all his time, journeying all over the country, seeing people, shaking hands, et cetera, et cetera. He wouldn't have had any time to focus on what he was needing to focus on in order to write his book. So it was a quite conscious decision at that early point, after the success of the first book. That's it. He stepped away from the limelight and he stayed out of it the rest of his life. Okay. Now let's go back to the screen sharing. So as much as we might tend to, Wilber simply can't be pigeonholed as a big brain, as an intellectual. Although he lives a mostly solitary life built around the mind, he has other dimensions. The prime example of this was his brief marriage to Terry, who later became Treya Killam. They married on November 26, 1983. Less than a month later, she was diagnosed with breast cancer. Let me see. How about Lisa? Could you read this 23 and then 24 in a minute?
Sure. During the next 6 years, he gave up his routine of writing and meditating almost entirely in order to care for her.
Treya became pregnant in 1984. This was medically inadvisable since it was thought that it would only make her breast cancer worse. Although neither of them had felt they wanted children initially, they decided to start a family once Treya was well again. With this in mind, they looked for a more suitable setting for a home. They settled on Incline Village in the state of Nevada, which is on the banks of Lake Tahoe, the largest mountain lake in the United States. It was about a 4-hour drive from their current home in San Francisco. Here, Treya had a mastectomy followed by radiation and then began chemotherapy. Now that year in 1985, Incline Village was hit by a strange viral disease, one of the symptoms of which was a feeling of total exhaustion. Only later was this virus that Wilber caught determined to be a condition now diagnosed as RNase enzyme deficiency disease, REDD. According to Wilber, RED is held to be responsible for illnesses such as, and what a list, multiple sclerosis, myalgic encephalomyelitis, ALS, inflammatory rheumatoid arthritis, Gulf War syndrome, and fibromyalgia. Just to give you an idea of what he experienced himself. Typically, the disease can be latent for a decade until it manifests itself as a condition of chronic fever caused by hypoxia or a lack of oxygen in the cells. Okay, Lisa, this is number 24.
As Wilber wrote in a recent email communication to his friends and colleagues, you feel like you're suffocating most of the time, and you're often bedridden around the clock, literally. Also, fortunately for me, this means mega meditation. It also means depression, sadness, and pain. Not so much for the pain in this body, but the pain of what this body can't do. Reflecting on the time with Treya, when he caught the disease, he writes, I sometimes think of this thing as a war wound I got when taking care of Treya, and sometimes that makes it easier to bear.
Thank you. So that was 1985, and he has had it ever since. 37 years.
Oh, gee.
Coming and going, sometimes, paralyzing him almost. And yet he's continued to write, he's continued to teach. He has seminars with people all the time. Amazing. In 1987, Treya's vision began to deteriorate. When she was examined, she was found to be suffering from cancer again, but this time there was a tumor in her brain and tumors in both lungs. The cancer had clearly metastasized. She and Ken decided to go to the Yanker Clinic in Bonn, West Germany, which prescribed a very aggressive therapy against advanced stages of cancer. At one point, Wilber was forced to spend a few days alone when Treya was not allowed to receive visitors due to a lung infection. He used the opportunity to think about what meeting her had meant to him. And Bill Kelly is the one who can read this one as part of it. 25.
In the religious traditions, spirit is found neither in heaven nor on earth, but in the heart has always been seen as the integration or the union point of heaven and earth. The point that earth grounded heaven and heaven exalted the earth. Neither heaven nor earth alone could capture spirit. Only the balance of the two found in the heart could lead to the secret door between death, morality, and mortality and pain. And that is, and that is what Treya had done for me. That is what we had done for each other. Pointed the way to the heart. When we were first together, we were sometimes irritated by these differences. Me, the absent-minded professor, Treya always hugging the ground, refusing to fly without planning the schedules ahead of time.
Thank you. And Joey, would you finish this passage off with number 26?
But we soon came to see that that was the entire point, that we were different, that maybe this applied to many men and women, and that far from being whole and self-contained people, we were each half people, one of the heaven, one of the earth. And that was exactly as we should be. We came to appreciate those differences, not just honor them, but be thankful for them. I will always be at home in ideas. Treya will always be at home in nature. But together, joined at the heart, we were whole. We could find that primal unity which neither alone could manage. Our favorite Plato quote became, men and women were once whole, but were torn in two, and the pursuit and desire of that whole is called love. The union of heaven and earth, I kept thinking as my eyes looked up and looked down. With Treya, I thought, I am just beginning to find my heart.
Mark, you told me that Treya had a Baha'i nurse at one time, right?
That's right. And
that she didn't, in Grace and Grit, didn't he write thy name is my healing, oh my God, because that's what the nurse used to pray for her, with Treya, right?
Correct, yes it is. I think the only time I've ever heard Baha'i associated with Wilber, so I haven't seen it in any of his books other than this one.
Hmm.
So there they are, two baldies together.
Oh.
To make a long story short, Treya died in 1989. Wilber tells the story of their relationship in his moving and uncharacteristically personal memoir, Grace and Grit, Spirituality and Healing in the Life and Death of Treya Killen Wilber. And in 2021, their story was actually turned into a movie. I was thinking of showing the trailer for it, but I decided against it. If you want, I can send it to you.
Alright.
So the URL. Okay. So from 1989 to 2002 is the period I want to cover now. He, after Treya's death, Wilber spent most of his waking hours writing and meditating. He declined all offers to speak and teach, except for meeting some groups of students from the Naropa Institute on occasion. He limited himself to a small circle of friends who often had trouble reaching him by phone. In those days, he rarely gave interviews. It was even difficult for journalist Tony Schwartz to make contact with him initially. But once they connected, they spent dozens of hours discussing his ideas and others. Okay, Danielle, could you read 27 and in a minute, number 28?
In response to my questions, he was invariably logical, cogent, and intellectually persuasive. Over time, I discovered that Wilber can also be warm, charming, patient, generous, funny, insightful, and entertaining. Tony Schwartz.
Mm-hmm. So what does Wilber offer us? Here is Schwartz's summary. An extraordinarily penetrating, synthetic, and discriminating intellect. A nearly encyclopedic knowledge of psychology, philosophy, mysticism, anthropology, sociology, religion, and physics. A vast personal knowledge of the states of consciousness that can be accessed through meditation. At the same time, Wilber is a critic of the individual strengths, myths, pretensions, shortcomings, and outright falsehoods contained in any given approach to wisdom. I think Abdu'l-Baha would have loved him. He pierces superstition like nobody else. He is more passionately interested in the higher states of consciousness than in the personal levels of ego development, and more drawn to the intellectual and spiritual realms than to those of the heart and the body. Since 2000, Wilber has devoted much of his attention to the creation and running of a series of integral institutes, as he calls them. These explore the application of his ideas to the fields of education, law, ecology, psychology, business, religion, among others. At last count, I think there were about 60 of them. So for the past 45 years, as near as I can determine, Wilber's main spiritual practice has been Buddhist meditation, at least 2 hours a day with dozens of longer retreats. And so that's number 28 from Danielle.
When I first started meditating, I sat for 3 to 4 hours a day. Once a week, I'd take a whole day and sit 10 or 12 hours. I still sit every day for at least 2 hours.
Now that was
in Tony Schwartz.
1997, I think that was written. Well, here's the man himself as a young man. So these are the benefits of meditation that he perceives. A greater sense of freedom, equanimity, clarity, and inner quiet, and a more focused yet spacious awareness. An increased capacity for even-handed self-observation. A way for the soul to venture inward, there ultimately to find a supreme identity with Godhead. And whatever else it does, and it does many beneficial things, meditation is first and foremost a search for the God within. So that's what I have to present tonight. I intentionally left us time to talk afterwards. The questions, whatever strikes you.
Mark, you want me to leave the recording on at this point?
No, I think we can turn it off now.